To the second event of the Distinguished Speakers Series in International Business this academic year. Please note that this event is being recorded. I'm Marina Augustidis, Associate Director of the Center for Global Business. The Center is the hub and driver of global education and activity at the Smith School. The mission of the Center is to connect the diverse members of the Smith School community to the world and the world to the Smith School community. To provide these members and partners with opportunities to gain a global mindset and build international business skills, and to serve as a Maryland resource center for companies seeking to take their goods into the global marketplace. The Center carries out this mission through 5 main areas of activity. They are school internationalization and partnerships, student programming, research and thought leadership, faculty development, and capacity building and trade for business. The Center is also one of 15 nationally recognized centers across the country to have been awarded a Title VI grant known as CIBE or CYBER. The CIBE grant is administered by the U.S. Department of Education and supports many of our activities, including this event today, and expands our mission outside the campus to industry and other academic institutions. The Distinguished Speaker Series brings together policymakers, industry leaders, academia, and students to discuss emerging trends in international business throughout the year. Today, we'll hear from Dr. Catherine Mann, Global Chief Economist of Citi, the 200-year-old global institution that provides financial services enabling growth and economic progress. Dr. Mann will discuss resilience in the global economy and what economic recovery could look like in the post-COVID environment. I'm honored to give a special welcome to our guest, Dr. Mann, and to the Center's Academic Director, Dr. Kisleya Prasad, who will take us into a discussion about these topics after I finish a few more opening comments. And before I turn it over to our speakers, let me share a few tips to help us move smoothly through the next hour. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded. It will be made publicly available via the school's website and emailed to all participants afterwards for future viewing. For optimal viewing, please select the grid view in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. Additionally, click on View in the toolbar in the upper left-hand corner, and then click Hide Non-Video Participants. Following the discussion, we will open up the conversation for questions from the audience. Throughout the discussion, please feel free to send your questions to the host in the chat function, and we'll try to get through as many as we can in the order that they are received at the end of the discussion. Additionally, if you are an undergraduate student seeking credit for iSmith, a QR code will appear on a slide at the end of the event. Please be sure to scan this to receive your credit. Once the event closes, you'll see a pop-up window with a link to take our 2-minute survey about the event. We appreciate your taking the time to complete that, as your feedback is critical to the development of future events. Please also be reminded to keep your cameras off and your microphones on mute throughout the event. And if there are any technical difficulties on our end or yours, we thank you in advance for your patience. Finally, undergraduate students participating today will receive information after the event about internship and developmental opportunities at Citi. Please also join us next month for International Education Week as we celebrate and recognize the global footprint of the Smith School through a series of events and other ways to engage with the Center. You can follow us on Twitter at Smith Global Biz for updated information. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Dr. Catherine Mann has served the role of Global Chief Economist at Citibank since 2018, where she is responsible for thought leadership, research guidance of a global team of economists, and cross-fertilization of research across macroeconomics, fixed income, and equities. Prior to her role at Citi, she served as Chief Economist at the OECD from 2014 to 2017. Dr. Mann has also held positions at Brandeis University, the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and the World Bank, among others. And today we find out that she's also taught in Maryland in the 1980s. Her research has concentrated on the U.S. trade deficit international capital flows, and a global markets perspective on information technology, services trade, and employment dynamics. Among her many publications, she frequently appears on Bloomberg, CNBC, and has been quoted in Business Week and The Economist. For her full biography, please go to our website. Joining Dr. Mann in the discussion today is Dr. Kisleya Prasad, Academic Director of the Center for Global Business and Research Professor here at Maryland Smith. Please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Thank you, Marina. So I know you have a couple of things to do before I can get started, so I'll just wait till you do that. And everyone can get the screen the way they want it to look.
Right. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Okay, so hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us and welcome. So I want to begin first by welcoming again Dr. Catherine Mann to the University of Maryland. It's indeed an honor to have you here. I wish we could have done it in Van Munching Hall, but those are the circumstances. Thank you. So we have relatively little time and a lot of ground to cover, so I'm going to keep my preamble to a minimum, but I do want to give everyone a quick outline for our discussion today. So clearly, we are in the shadow of the global pandemic, and that's going to frame much of our discussion. So to just take stock of where we are, the novel coronavirus was first identified in Wuhan, China at the end of last year. It probably arrived here in the US in January, and we were possibly having community spread as early as last February. On March 11th, the World Health Organization declared this to be a global pandemic. As we all know, by mid-March, we had gone into the so-called Great Lockdown, which had a devastating effect on the world economy. And it's now mid-October, and a bit more is known about how the world economy has responded to this shock. So it's a good time to take stock of where we are and think a little bit about what we've learned. There's no denying that the human cost has been enormous, although possibly the worst scenarios that people visualized have not materialized, at least not yet, and some countries have done better than others. Still, a number of uncertainties remain. While we don't have first we don't have a fixed end date in sight, and then it's not entirely clear what the post-COVID-19 future is going to look like. But we are fortunate today that we have Dr. Mann with us, and we can pose these questions to her and ask her more about where we are and what the future is going to look like. So my plan is to begin by asking about the current state of the economy, the downturn caused by the pandemic, the subsequent rebound, the current general direction, and then move on to the second part of the discussion that will focus on the possible long-term effects of the pandemic. What will be the world that we're going to transition into? Will the business environment be fundamentally transformed, and so on? And after that, I'll open it up for audience questions, which you, as Marina said, you're welcome to send along even now. Dr. Mann, welcome again. But before I start, I would like to ask if you could tell us something about your role at Citi and what being the global chief economist entails. And thank you again for being here.
Well, thanks very much for inviting me. I always take the opportunity to talk with students, alumni and other professors obviously as well, but I have a definite soft spot in my heart for students who actually, are going to be carrying on forward in both policy making in business as well as in academia. So students are the future, and that's why I like to work with them as much as possible. So how did I get to Citi, and what do I do here? Well, as you heard in my bio, I've had many different jobs in the academic sphere, in the policy sphere. I worked at the Federal Reserve Board early in my career, which is where I was teaching at Maryland in the evenings while I was at the Federal Reserve Board. And so coming into the private sector, the objective was to really understand the transmission mechanism of monetary policy through the financial sector onto the real economy. And in order to really get a sense of how that was working, I needed to come into the financial sector in order to do that. I had seen, the others, been sort of the viewer from the outside quite a bit in the rest of my career, but I wanted to see how it really worked on the inside. And so that's my pathway into the private sector and into being the global chief economist at Citi. Citi is a unique institution in terms of its global footprint, and that also is a tremendous strength to understanding possible channels through which both central bank policy, as well as in the context of COVID, of course, fiscal policy, is affecting economic progress. What do I do here? The sort of the meat and potatoes stuff is every month we have to do a projection exercise, which involves coordinating the views of our country economists around the world. That we frame in each month with a new topic area. I've looked at, for example, the CapEx collapse. I've looked at the role of consumer services. One month we talked about productivity growth and the prospects for that. So that's meat and potatoes. The other things that we do are topical. Road to the White House series has been very, very valuable as we've have a lead economist working on that topic. That is an example, though, of the kind of work that we do where, as economists, we frame the overall issue and potential implications for different sectors of growth and growth overall, countries and sectors. And then we pass that work to the researchers in the asset classes, equities, credit, fixed income, U.S. treasuries or other sovereign entities, and commodities. And then they write about their individual asset area, as well as do a deep digging into how the macroeconomic environment that we're proposing is going to take place, how that affects individual companies. So when we think about the work that we do, it spans the macro, really, GDP, global GDP. That's pretty much as macro as you get. And then it gets down to individual stocks and individual credits, if we're talking about high yield, fallen angels, these sorts of things. So it's my job is to be the spanner of all that. I have to span countries, I have to span sectors, and I have to span asset classes. So that's where integrating economics more broadly into the research function and the asset allocation decisions goes.
Great, thank you. So I'll turn this to our topic for today. And I wanted to ask you first, 10 months into the pandemic, what, in your view, is the current state of the global economy, and where do you see us now? Where do you see us moving forward?
So, of course, you know that we're not the only people who do forecasts. There are quite a few other groups out there. All of us have been operating with the projections, which of course is showing up in the data as we have been collecting it. This is the worst economic contraction in living memory. And it is particularly bad for countries that are dependent on things like tourism, imagine a Thailand. Other countries that are dependent on technology, say a Taiwan, are in better shape. But everyone has been experiencing the worst economic contraction in memory. So that is we're there. We've done that. We've been there, done that. So now the question really is, what is the prospects for the second half of this year and into 2021? How fast do we dig out of the hole that COVID has put us into? And what is the momentum going forward into 2021? So I'm going to contrast where we have been in our monthly forecasts with, say, the IMF. As you know, the IMF World Bank meetings are underway right now in Washington, D.C. Normally, we would all be there and be rubbing shoulders with everybody else in the corridors. But now it's virtual, of course. But if you've noted that, the IMF actually raised their projection for the global economy for 2020 from their last issue, which was in April, and then there was an update in June. So they actually, if you just are somebody who looks at deltas, the changes, you would listen to the IMF and you say, oh wow, they're not as pessimistic. So maybe things are going to be better. I contrast that with what we have done as we have moved our monthly forecasts throughout this pandemic period, including up until now. Our last forecast was in September 22nd. We have another forecast round starting next week. We have continued to write down our projections. Not in every country, but for globally, we have written down our projections for 2020. Now, the other observation is, what about 2021? And on this, basically everybody's less optimistic now than they were before. So we have a picture of an economy that is deep hole, getting out of it, rebounding, but then that rebound, that momentum is starting to fade. And I have written, I'm also concerned about a stall. So not just a momentum fading, but actually a stall in terms of prospects for the global economy going forward. In our September projections, we wrote down the global growth rate by 30 basis points. That's actually a lot. We usually kind of tend to move in maybe tenths. So the 30 basis points is a big decline. Again, different, there's some regional variation which you can talk about if you want to, but this is a prospect that is concerning going forward, because what it means is that the rebound is not actually going to be even strong enough to return us to where we were in January of this year. For the global economy, we might not get to the equivalent GDP of January this year until the beginning of 2022. That implies there's a lot of loss, job loss, capital stock loss, as I say, CapEx collapsing. Why do you invest in anything if you're not going to be able to sell your stuff? And they're basically saying you're not going to sell your stuff anymore until no robust, whatever you thought was going to happen in January, it's going to take you 2 years to get back there. So this is a story of an economy, a global economy that is very challenged and is in some sense desperate for the type of policy that is going to catalyze private sector activity going forward. And that's what, when we talk about policy, that is really the question that we have right now, is what role does the complementarity and the synergy between fiscal and monetary policy? It's been pretty good so far, the synergies, but we really need to do more. We need to do different. We really need to do different in terms of our policies going forward. For fiscal in particular, a lot of life preservers, very important in terms of bolstering economic jobs and wages. Different countries are doing different things, of course. Low interest rates, obviously asset purchases in the case of many central banks. But there has to be a pivot on both of these to focus much more on how do we actually engage private sector activity to have more robust growth for the longer term, short term and longer term, demand side and supply side, so that we can change this trajectory, which right now is really not one that is particularly optimistic.
That was a question I was going to get to later about policy, so maybe I'll jump ahead to that and come back to it later. And you partially expressed a view on that, but currently Secretary Mnuchin and Congress, they're going back and forth, and the situation looks pretty grim for a new round of stimulus, if you might call it. If you were to think back to the timing and the scope, the scale of both fiscal and monetary policy since the start, I mean, would you say that it's been inspired, adequate, lacking? Where would you land on that spectrum of how we've done in terms of policy response to the contraction?
I think it's important to make to kind of think about policies, both fiscal and monetary policy, making distinctions about how institutions differ across different countries, and that has been manifested in how the policies have been implemented. But to step back from that, inspired is a bit strong of a accolade to the policymakers. But if we compare the global financial crisis and the policy responses then to the policy responses to this crisis, I can, without a doubt, it is appropriate to say that fiscal and monetary policy authorities acted very quickly and very big. And we had said they really needed to. We had a note that was titled, "Go big, go now," and that was back in April, or maybe it was March. I can't remember the dates, but we looked at the cascading effects of this COVID crisis, the extent to which the lockdowns were disproportionately affecting consumer demand in the services sector, incredibly important for advanced economies. We were looking at the extent to which, we were already doing trade wars, mind you. So we were not starting with the international environment in pretty good shape there. We were already having trade wars disrupting supply chains, and now we had COVID and the extent to which COVID was affecting different countries at different time periods. This was very disruptive to global supply chains, global investment. So we had that happening. We also had a lot of fear factor, of course. And so, in the face of that, the types of monetary and fiscal policy that were instituted looked huge at the time. We were saying even then, you need to be bigger. And we were particularly saying to Europe at that time, Europe needs to do more. It needs to be more coherent within the European context. The U.S. programs being very large, we can argue about whether they were appropriately targeted to who it needed to be most supported. You can always do that sort of Monday morning quarterbacking, but the fact that both fiscal and monetary authorities worked synergistically, in other words, together, and very fast and pretty big, that this was very important and really was quite distinguished from what happened after the global financial crisis, where the packages were small, they were delayed, the Fed was late. Europe did the wrong things. They tightened both fiscal and monetary policy, thus causing the sovereign debt crisis, double dip. And so very different kind of policy response immediately after the crisis.
What would you say what they should be doing right now, sort of currently? Yeah.
So as I say, the challenge at this point is, the fiscal obligations are getting pretty large. That we can measure them a couple of different ways: big deficits to GDP, rising debt burdens to GDP, and we're not. On the one hand, we do not suggest austerity. That's completely the wrong thing to do at this point. But what we are saying is that as we think about this next phase, where COVID is not under control yet, clearly, but you can almost see getting there. And so this is a time when the fiscal authorities in particular, as I say, need to be thinking about this pivot. We threw out the life preservers, absolutely the right thing to do. But we have to think forward, how are we going to catalyze private sector investment? Because ultimately, there's no amount of government money that can save the world, right? It has to be private sector economic activity, which creates employment, which creates consumption, trade, these sorts of things. So how do you catalyze private sector activity is the real question. And when we look at different countries around the world or different regions around the world, we are seeing very different approaches to sort of phase 2 of fiscal effort. For example, in Europe, we see the European Recovery Fund and how it is making an effort to focus on, it's a tax, it's a spend, and it's a rules and regulations. These are the three things that governments do. They spend, they tax, and they do rules and regulations. And so when we talk about fiscal programs and fiscal activities, it's really important to be talking about all three dimensions. But when we look at the European Recovery Fund, it is one that is designed to have, there's some life preservers still in there, but there's also the rebuild. What are we going to build? You know, building the better boat. In going forward, the focus on digital, the focus on climate. And both of these are important because when we think about, let's go to monetary policy for a minute. We know that the monetary policy authorities have exploded their balance sheets, 4 or 5 times more on larger balance sheets than they did after the GFC. Where is all that credit going? Where's all that money going? And what we can say is that it's going into asset prices right now. It's not going into CapEx. And so, asset prices do not create the wherewithal to repay your obligations. If it's just shifting around chairs on the Titanic. So what we need to do is to get the motivation for the private sector to move from using credit availability and monetary policy accommodation. What we need to do is to get that to the real economy through the private sector. So one way we can think about that is we know that most companies and most countries are not yet on a path to meet the 2 degrees centigrade objectives of the Paris Agreement. And maybe we won't make those goals, but to do so requires private sector investment in mitigation, adaptation, and innovation. That requires real money in the real economy that generates new capital activities, tangible things and intangibles, as well as employment. And so thinking about how does the public sector interventions, the fiscal policy and fiscal activities, is it going to move in the direction of doing that? The climate dimension on the European Recovery Fund moves in that direction. We see it in some other countries as well in their fiscal policy packages. Right now, of course, the United States has 2 very competing views about what a fiscal policy package might look like under the 2 administrations.
Thank you. I'd like to follow up on one other thing that you mentioned, which is regional variation. And you mentioned Thailand, tourism.
Right.
But again, I was also looking at the IMF numbers that just came out. How much do you think those numbers reflect how well the different parts of the world have done in terms of handling the health crisis at hand, the COVID crisis? What's your take on that?
It's a very good question. There certainly is a relationship between the handling of the health crisis and the subsequent macroeconomic performance. But it's not 1-to-1. But there is a clear relationship. So, but there's also, I think it's also fair to say that countries differ in terms of their population's response to government. Trust in government is an important ingredient in how effective a policy response might be by the government on behalf of its citizens with respect to COVID. So, the bottom line is that we know that China has been able to, first in, so to speak, first the origin of the pandemic, although it was circulating in other countries now that we know that, very early on as well. But they have been able to, in very difficult circumstances, the first recession, that negative quarter of growth that they had in 50 years, or so. They experienced that in Q1, but subsequently they have been able to be moving forward on a path towards growth. They are back in growth phase. Industrial production is back to about the growth rate that it was in previous pre-COVID times. Retail sales is positive, but not yet to the same kind of pace of growth as before. And some of the services indicators that we use have yet to get into positive territory. So this kind of pathway that different types, different sectors are improving at different rates is something that we see in China, we see it in other countries as well. Asia in general has been able to handle the health aspects of the crisis better. The citizenry seem to be able to trust their governments more, and therefore there's a synergy between the way governments approached the crisis and the way citizens approached it. Europe, tighter restrictions, but even in countries that didn't have a very tight environment, for example, a Sweden compared to a Denmark, both the population did respond with following social distancing and mask wearing and so forth to try to stem the cases. We are now unfortunately seeing a resurgence in Europe, which is very troubling because of its potential impact on people's fear factor and second wave of concerns about consumer spending. The U.S. I think people think of it. It is a big country. Different parts of the U.S. have been different examples of how the relationship between policy trust and consumer response or individual response. So that the Northeast is perhaps a little bit more like Europe and Northern Europe, and now other parts of the U.S. are perhaps more like other parts of Europe or Latin America.
Thank you. So I'll move us to the second part of our discussion, which is the sort of the longer term effects of the pandemic. And so I guess my first question here would be that there's been much speculation about what happens at the other side of the pandemic. I mean, which businesses and sectors will make it, which ones will disappear, be fundamentally transformed. So thinking forward, what do you think the post-pandemic future will look like? Do you think the business environment will be very different, or are we swiftly back to the older normal?
So I think there are two things two directions to take that discussion. Let me start with sort of the macroeconomic view, and then I will pivot into to a more micro or business view. So from a macroeconomic perspective, the things that we are concerned about the post-COVID environment is that this lengthy time where we have the long time to get even to the pre-COVID level of GDP, and then beyond that, this is something that this long period is associated with labor market scarring. People are disassociated from the labor force, or their skills don't match, and these sorts of things. Of course, they've been unemployed. That's very bad for them personally. You have the erosion of the capital stock that comes from a period of time without capital investment. And then you have a sluggish productivity growth. And we know that these are the three elements that underpin longer-term growth rates in economies. And so none of those are good. And so when we talk about what might be the burden of a longer period of time where we have labor market scarring, capital sluggishness, capital stock erosion, and productivity sluggishness, somebody's going to bear the burden of that. And we can look at the GFC, post-GFC, for a similar scenario. In other words, you've kind of seen this movie before. After the GFC, the growth rate in the global economy ultimately came back, but at a loss of about 7% or 5% of GDP, global GDP, that was never recovered. We worry about that in this environment as well. And we can look at, what was the consequence of that? rising inequality within age groups. We know about that. People talk about that quite a bit. But the other consequence is that the lifetime trajectory of earnings for younger cohorts, in other words, people who are kind of in their 30s and 40s now, very different earnings profile. They don't have the same kind of earnings profile as an earlier generation had. And that's a big concern because those are the people who ultimately are going to have to repay the obligations. And then people who are even younger face challenges, labor market entry and the wages associated with that. So this is something that is very challenging. We also think about older people. It's not like they get off scot-free here. Pensions and healthcare are more difficult to finance under this type of scenario, and also to the extent that they have been savers, this overall package of concerns is associated with lower long-term interest rates. And to the extent that the older population is in their saving mode, or they're dissaving out of a wealth, the wealth environment is looks less good. Particularly, this is true in Europe, where savings tends to be in the form of bonds and deposits. In the U.S., a lot of people, there are some people who own equities either directly or indirectly, and to that extent, recent behavior on equities, of course, has been very beneficial, but it's very narrowly held in the U.S. It's not the full population. So that's kind of a macro picture, and it goes back to why we're so concerned about what fiscal policy is going to look like. Now, from the micro picture, what's going to be different? Are we going to go back to the way we were? I think the answer is no. It's very clear just from looking at talking with even our own business model at Citi. There is going to be a lot more digitalization. There's going to be a lot more work from home or work from the office or virtual meetings. And so, there is some structural changes that are relevant for the office culture. We also see there's no doubt there's a continuation of the trend towards online sales that was already in train, but it's obviously received an enormous boost coming from the COVID period, so that we already see that in terms of the use of malls for warehouses. And so real estate functionality changes for sure. In investment in technology, which has been robust. It actually fell off in the Q2 data. No CapEx was positive in Q2, but on balance, looking forward, the investment in information technology and everything that goes along with that. I mean, investment in information technology, we're talking about the firms that are involved. We're talking about the people who are skilled in the activities associated with information technology, both the hardware as well as the software. So we call it tangible and intangibles. There's all of the follow-on use of information technology by all sorts of firms. You don't have to work for Google. You can be the IT person at a hospital, for example. These are trends that were already in place, and they have just gotten another boost. And so we're not going to go back to exactly the way we were before. I think there's going to be a lot of pent-up demand when there's a successful vaccine. I think a lot of people want to go travel. They want to do their entertainment, sports, and restaurants. So that will be back, but it will be a different group. It will be a different group because there's a lot of businesses that are not going to survive this.
Thank you. So digitization was one of my questions which you answered. Let me ask you about something else, which is global supply chains.
Mm-hmm.
What might the lasting effects on global supply chains be? So at least initially when the pandemic started, there was a lot of talk of reshoring or making supply chains more resilient. Mm-hmm. So in that, what are some of the trends you see happening and what you anticipate will be the case in the future?
So on supply chains, I think it's also important to note that there's quite a bit of corporate reevaluation of their supply chains even before COVID. So again, COVID is accentuating a lot of transitions that were really already in place, and supply chain reassessment is one of them. Let's talk about some of the factors that are affecting and have been affecting what corporations think about when they think about their supply chains. One factor has to do with ESG. The desire on the part of consumers to know where their product is being produced. So there's a lot of transparency that firms need to have about where their stuff is actually produced. The Dodd-Frank legislation, that was a long time ago, but the Dodd-Frank legislation had requirements for transparency on conflict minerals. So this is not a new thing. It's been around for a long time. It was particularly on conflict minerals. Now there is a broader assessment. Another example is Rana Plaza, the disaster in Bangladesh where the building collapsed, the textile building collapsed, and there were companies that first they denied that they had any suppliers there, and then they realized that they did. They just didn't know because they were kind of arm's length suppliers, and so there was a reputational consequence for that. So increased transparency about the supply chain being an important ingredient that firms already were trying to deal with. Number two, the issue about trade wars and, again, carbon footprint being an important ingredient in thinking about localization or diversification. Now, this doesn't have to be supply chains coming home, because, of course, if you are producing for, say, the Chinese market, you're going to put your supply chain close to your customer in China. You're not going to put it in Europe and then ship it to China because that's a bigger carbon footprint. You also run sort of geopolitical and trade war type risks. So diversification implies that you will have multiple locations around the world from which to source your critical supplies. Again, firms were already thinking about this. Think about what happened with Fukushima. Turns out, who knew that there were critical ingredients that were only being produced at plants there, that the Icelandic volcano, whose name I cannot pronounce, that was an example. The Thailand floods and implications for disk drives. Again, these are old things, and yet they become more salient as COVID exposes more concerns, both from a political standpoint, but also from these other standpoints about wanting to have diversification in your supply base. Now, the last element that firms are talking about, and is, if you're going to have transparency, you're going to have diversification, and the diversification is in order to be able to be responsive to shocks, then you need to have flexibility. So if you have a shock in one country, you need to have the flexibility to go source from a different production location. So if we put all those three new demands onto the supply chain optimization strategy of firms, you end up with, again, an incredibly important role for AI and information technology, because that's the only way that you can have transparency and diversification and flexibility without having higher costs. And ultimately, costs do matter.
Mm-hmm. So thank you. I have other questions, but I think with a view to the time, maybe we get to some of the audience questions, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So I think we promised them in the order received. So let me go up. So this is a question from Dolly. Where do you see innovation to propel the rebound when traditional industries like tourism, etc., are collapsing?
Where do I see innovation when traditional industries such as tourism are collapsing? So, as I said, I think that there are some critical areas where innovation is crucial to achieve sustainable objectives going forward. I gave the example of climate. We have to have innovation in order to achieve our climate objectives. And I do believe that these climate objectives, whether you detail it as the Paris Agreement or have a different benchmark, different objective, we got to get there. We got to change energy usage. We have to change choice of energy supply. Citi has done some publicly available reports under our Global Prospects Series, GPS, Citi GPS, under the rubric of energy Darwinism. I think there are 3 versions of that, 3 different issues now. And there are ways to reduce the carbon footprint without reducing energy usage. A lot of people think that the situation is the only way to get to our climate objectives, our carbon objectives, is through reduced use of energy. And although that certainly is one strategy, it's a transformation of the energy choices from one type of energy with a higher carbon footprint to another kind of energy with a lower carbon footprint. That is an important ingredient to achieve the objectives of the Paris Agreement. Another sort of report that I think is important to look at on the innovation side, and again, I'm looking at carbon. That climate is it's a clear and present danger. It's not in the future. When I was at the OECD, we did some work when the Germans were in the G20 presidency and did an evaluation of what types of policies could achieve the objectives and be growth enhancing. And it did involve carbon transformation. Other sorts of innovation, I think one key aspect about innovation is that it's not, when we think about the percolation of innovation throughout an economy, it's, we know from research that there are companies that are at the frontier. They tend to be the larger companies. It's not just, Google's and so forth. It's any company that is at the frontier of its industry is the one that is innovating, and it is adopting productivity enhancements and is pushing out the frontier. But when we think about aggregate productivity in an economy overall, we see a tremendous dispersion from the most advanced leading companies to everyone else, the smaller companies. And so one of the important questions that I think we have to address going forward, again, if we want to change this future that isn't so bright and that we have to have more robust productivity growth, a stronger capital stock, and labor market skills to match that, it's about how to bring existing available innovations to a broader swath of companies within a country. And that is a different challenge. That's a different kind of productivity enhancement than finding the new thing, the big new thing. And if you had to compare, like if you had to choose one, and you don't, but let's suppose you did as a policymaker to choose one to incentivize. Do you incentivize the adoption of existing technologies by a broader group of firms within your economy, or do you incentivize at the frontier? You actually get more bang for your buck by incentivizing the adoption of existing technologies by the broader swath of firms within your economy. Couple reasons why. One is it's available. It's adopting existing technologies, and it could be computer technologies, it could be climate understanding, it could be this fancier supply chain stuff. All going to be different depending on the industry of what's really critical at the frontier, critical to adopt in order to enhance productivity growth at the firm. But not only so you're adopting something that exists. So we're talking about improving existing firms. But the other thing that we know is that if you enhance the productivity of the firm, you also improve wages for workers. And this is a key ingredient, of course, to be supportive of the societal objectives that we have as policymakers, but also in this bigger macroeconomic context. You want the benefits of productivity growth to go out to employment, wages, and therefore the capacity to demand stuff, the GDP on the demand side. So again, to the extent that you get adoption of existing innovations, available innovations more broadly throughout firms in an economy, that raises wages for workers at those firms. They tend to also, they're more skill-oriented. They will train their workers. And we know a lot of this from the type of extremely detailed work that is done at the OECD, some of the work that my teams did when I was there and continues to be done now.
Thank you. Michael asks, the economic downturn is different from others in that certain companies such as Amazon or manufacturers of electronics, etc., are doing very well. And how might this impact what the recovery looks like, and what will be the impact for different parts of society?
Mm-hmm. So we're still in the phase of dealing with the virus and figuring out how to try to do what we're doing even as the virus is around us. And that is why many firms are increasing their digital investment, or if they haven't done it yet, they're intending to try to continue on operations, even if they are, even in the face of difficult pandemic, social distancing, concerns about working in the workplace, concerns about transportation, this sort of thing. Individuals in their own buying habits, again, there are a lot of things that people would spend their money on or did spend their money on in terms of discretionary consumer services. They can't spend their money on that either because they're afraid of being in public places or in closer proximity to other people, or because they can't. I mean, international travel, it's just not, there's a lot of places you can't go. And other sporting events, can't go there. So a lot of people have taken, a lot of people have saved their money, actually. Some very good work at the New York Fed detailing the demographic and income breakdowns of savings rates. Very important and very important detailed work there that give us a picture of how much savings has taken place. And then, so they save some of it, and the other part they have been putting towards doing what they can do, which is buying stuff, both at some stores, as they have been either stayed open as essential or have become opened more recently, but also online. And that's why, companies that are in the, FANGs or whatever acronym you want to use, that's why the technology companies and the online companies have been doing so well. When we come to the other side of this, I think what our own analysts have been addressing is there have been clear winners as there have been dramatic shift in consumer activity and in business activity. The question, and their stock valuations have mirrored that. The question is, those winners have priced in being winners, and as there's a shift, and the question is when there will be a shift back towards consumer discretionary activities. I think a lot of people would like to go travel again. I used to travel 40% of the time, and I miss it.
As do I.
Okay. So, and we all want to go to the museums and restaurants and sporting and the whole gyms, et cetera, right? So we want to do these things. So there's going to be a rebound. And the question is, when are we going to be able to do it? And that's the crystal ball thing on vaccines, and not just having a vaccine discovered, but implementing it, and people believing that it affords them immunity from the disease. That's a long process.
So the next question from Adam actually is a follow-up on what you were talking earlier, and he says research by NBR has shown that nearly 60% of stimulus payments have been either used to pay down debt or add to personal savings. And so he asks, is the low marginal propensity to consume a policy failure, or will consumer behavior pay off in the long term with pent-up demand?
Good question, challenging question. Some of the stimulus payments, the paying down debt, that is creating the capability for consumers to run that back up if they want to. I think there's some concern, particularly at lower income levels, that some of the credit card balances that we're seeing, increased household borrowing is not a good sign. That's a concern that with the stimulus payments and the unemployment benefits fading off, that certain income groups are going back to kind of using credit cards as their means of livelihoods, shopping, and so forth. The marginal, at the higher level, one of the things that is very true is consumption of discretionary services. The share of your consumer basket that is discretionary services increases with income. So when we think about the marginal propensity to consume, it is negatively correlated with income, and therefore we know that richer people don't consume as much as others, and they have disproportionately been unable to consume the services that they normally would. So that will rebound when the time comes and the situation is going to. I don't want to say return to normal because I don't think it ever will. So, but I don't call this a policy failure because a lot of people did spend their money and their stimulus payments on cars, on other consumer durables, on housing. And so the transmission mechanism maybe wasn't perfect, but the timing that was necessary for the speed at which the Congress passed these stimulus bills is kind of remarkable. Again, we could go back and when we can Monday morning quarterback and say, well, they should have done X, Y, or Z. Yes, and we'll all study this as researchers for a long time. But the speed was necessary, and the fact that it was imperfect, I think, should not overshadow that it does create a pent-up demand for when things become more normal. These checks did create spending on a range of important industries, autos being one of them, and did create and housing. Another important industry is housing. So that these are important parts of the transmission mechanism, and in that sense, it worked.
Okay, thank you. Now, the last question will be, this is from Rebecca Bellinger. What can SMEs do to survive the stall in economic recovery that you predict next year? Government programs, payroll protection, for example, have only gone so far, as you noted earlier. What does catalyzing private sector activity, in quotes from what you said earlier, look like for SMEs?
This is a very, very challenging area. It's a very tough situation because SMEs, let's kind of divide SMEs up into different categories. There are SMEs that are in the manufacturing sector that have collateral, that have supply chain relationships to larger firms. These are SMEs that were able to and successfully. National Association of Manufacturers study of this is quite clear. We're very successful in accessing the payroll protection program. to the extent that they are suppliers to some of these other areas in manufacturing which have been able to buoy up using the sort of the broader stimulus that we just talked about. So they are probably okay. Then there are SMEs that are in the services sector, and particularly minority-owned SMEs, where it's it's a service, right? So first, there's no collateral. There's nothing to borrow against, and you are not generating revenues. So getting, kind of bridging over to the other side of COVID is extremely challenging. And the Main Street Lending Program was one theoretical avenue, but it's been very difficult to deploy and needs reassessment, I think. I think the Fed would agree with that. And a second round of the Payroll Protection Program, I think, has been part of various of the stimulus X4, which of course is sort of not on the table right now, but there are different pieces of it. How do you lend to businesses that are essentially standalone, as opposed to part of a broader ecosystem? I think this is a very, very difficult question to do, because ultimately many of them will not survive. Some of the data, it's survey data, so we don't know exactly where we are in terms of the actual numbers, but there are survey data that are more than half of the SMEs that are in this category won't survive.
Thank you so much. Well, that brings us to the end of our hour. I can't thank you enough. It's been a real treat. I really enjoyed this conversation, and it's, again, very kind of you to spend this time talking to our students. So thank you so much, and my thanks to the audience, everybody who turned up as well.
Thank you very much, and great to hear from the students. There were excellent questions, and hopefully maybe one day I'll helicopter in and be able to give you a class in person. That would be great.
That would be great. We would love that. Hopefully at the other end of this, we can have you here in person in Van Munching Hall. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.